Hi, and welcome to Code Corner. My name is Ryan Mayfield, founder of Mayfield Renewables. And this is a video series that we do talking about specific code sections. And today we're talking about the 2020 National Electrical Code, specifically looking at Article 705.11, sub C and D, which is dealing with supply side connections. So the 2020 code added 705.11. And so we have another video going through A and B. And so going through these different sections to kind of help line out what this new code section is requiring in order for these supply side connections. So jumping over straight into 705.11c, the requirement, we have the code section here, and what this is going to require is that we have overcurrent devices provided for the conductors when we make a connection to the supply side of a service disconnect. And we'll have an image here in just a minute to kind of help illustrate this. And one of the questions that has always come up, and we've been doing supply side connections for a long time in PV systems. 2020, we added this section, which was great in order to get some clarity and some real definitive rules around what the requirements are. And one of them is this length question. And so the question's always been, how far can I run my conductors before I put my overcurrent device in place? And so what the code is telling us here, 705.11c, is it's giving us actually two different allowances or two different requirements, if you will. And one being for systems that are connected to dwelling units and others that are connected to other than dwelling units. And so the requirement for our dwelling units is basically 10 feet of conductor length. And we get up to 16.5 feet in other than dwelling units. So the big question, well, one of the questions always has been the 10 foot has been a thing that's been relatively accepted, but that's always been a question of, is that 10 feet as I pull a tape measure? Is that 10 feet of conductor length? What exactly am I basing the 10 feet off of? And we now have in 2020 code a very clear conductor length requirement. So you get 10 feet of conductor from that point of connection to your first overcurrent device when you're installing on a dwelling unit, and you get up to 16.5 feet or 5 meters if you're doing, in a more commercial type setting. The other allowance that we see here in number 2 is if you're not able to get an overcurrent device within 16.5 feet of these non-dwelling units, you can actually go up to 71 feet or 20 meters if you have current limiters installed in that circuit within the 16.5 feet. So there's a little bit of an allowance there that's going to be utilized for your commercial systems, not your residential systems. And so the big thing here is, again, the 10 feet versus the 16.5 with a little bit of leeway if you are looking at the commercial type systems. So let's look at an image here. So 705.11c, this specific image is, as you can see, for a commercial type system, 3-phase conductors. You get a conductor length for that supply side connection. So again, the supply side connection, meaning we're connecting our PV system on the supply side of the service disconnecting means. So here in the main service panel, we're showing a main breaker. We're making that connection on the supply side. And then your length is dependent on where you make that connection and how far away your overcurrent device is. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward and helpful for people just knowing, now we know exactly what kind of length we have to work with. The other part of 705.11 I want to talk about in this episode is the connections. And so connections are required to be made using listed connectors described in 110.14, comply with any fill requirements. So if when you are making those connections, you're adding conductors inside of a panel, or you're somehow getting onto those service conductors. If you're modifying the equipment, you have to do it based on the manufacturer's instructions, or it needs to be evaluated for the application and field labeled. So you can go through and have a field label applied. You're going to have to get it inspected. You're going to have to go through, exactly how can you modify this equipment And that is possible. And so that's definitely something that people have done. And, we're seeing being applied in the field for these supply side type connections. So I want to, show you a picture here. So here's a situation where supply side connection was being made. And so going through and, doing the calculations, you can see some lugs were added onto the bus bars. And so going through and verifying that that's within the manufacturer's instructions. If not, getting it evaluated and field labeled was the requirement here. So these are all, paths forward for you on making those connections. Another thing I want to point out, it's not specifically called out in 705.11, but in the 2020 code, there's a reference, 230.46 is the reference, and that's talking about service connections. And it's saying that when we make connections like this on the service side of the system disconnecting means that those connections, in this case, those lugs that we're looking at, have to be rated for service connections. So you have to have service rated lugs in order to do this. And so this is becoming, there was an allowance in the 2020 code that gave us till 2023 in order to meet that. We're past that point. And so now any time you're making these connections, they have to be service rated. So that's an important thing to look at with your manufacturer, whoever that you're working with, to specify those lugs that they have service rated lugs. And they're out there. We've talked with manufacturers in the past. They're out there. More stuff is coming on market all the time. And so manufacturers have been able to list their products or are in the process of listing their products for that service rated requirement. So be aware of that, and how you're making that connection. Make sure that you're doing it to both 705.11 and then the 230 reference that is new in the 2020 code. So that's going to wrap up the 705.11 video. We covered this and other code topics in great detail in the workshops we provide, both in person and online. Our team also provides design and engineering services, as well as consulting for PV and energy storage manufacturers and EPCs. So if you'd like to learn more about the services, please give us a call or visit us at mayfield.energy.